Tell me what happened.
I was there. They crucified him. I can show you where they buried him. What difference does it make at this point?
I understand. But just start from the beginning.
Well, it was amazing. A few years back, a guy shows up making all kinds of crazy claims. He spent most of his time at the river. That's where I would go to listen. Then one afternoon, he just stops. Mid-sentence points and says, "Look." So we all looked. "Look," he said, "the Lamb of God." Just what we all needed, right? A lamb. That's the first time I saw him. The lamb, that is. Jesus.
You were with Jesus as well.
I was, for 3 years, right up until, well, yesterday. It was amazing. He was amazing. And the crowds, I've never seen so many people in one place. And it was everywhere. Everywhere we went, more crowds. They came to listen. They came to watch. Some came to criticize. Others to be healed. And he touched untouchable people, and they were healed.
I'm not sure I understand. He was healing people, but you seem offended.
He told a man his sins were forgiven. People are so naive. Only God can forgive sin. His followers made mockery of the law, and he never lifted a finger to stop them. He would defend them. He would defend them and criticize us. Us! I was there the day he claimed to be greater than the temple. Then the rumors started. Rumors that he would actually destroy the temple. And the ignorant peasants he surrounded himself with believed him. Worse than peasants. Sinners, tax gatherers, women.
He told me about me, the part of me that shames me. But I didn't feel shame that afternoon. Before that day, I can't remember when I haven't felt shame. But that day I felt alive.
They knew we were coming. Now, by that time, they knew every move we made. We didn't know who to trust. But that didn't concern him. So, off we went into the jaws of the lion, Jerusalem. And the whole world was waiting for us. They lined the streets. The sound of their shouts was deafening. And I'll admit, it went to our heads. But not him. He seemed preoccupied. I would say worried, but I'm not sure that he ever worried. And then things got strange. He made Passover all about him. You know, he said the bread was his body and the wine was his blood. We were used to that kind of thing, but this seemed more unusual than normal, even for him. Then he announced a new covenant. We had no idea what that meant. And then he gave us a new command. And we certainly didn't need any more of those.
So, what was the problem?
The problem? Jesus was the problem. The crowds loved him. The crowds flocked to him. And the crowds not only believed him, They were beginning to believe in him. That was a problem. So, we took care of it.
You mean you killed him?
No, Rome killed him. Lucky for us, it was one of his own that led us to him. And once we had him, well, all the other peasants scattered, as we suspected they would. But let's be clear. We did not kill him.
Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. I should have made him their king. I saw more courage, more integrity in those eyes than in the eyes of any of their high priests. They were jealous. Ask my wife. I tried to save him. But as soon as I mentioned king, we have no king but Caesar, they chanted. And in that moment, I realized I had no choice. And then I crucified their king. But for the record, they are responsible, not me. Doesn't matter now. What matters now is that Passover is over. Things will settle down now.
So, what do you do now?
We hide. We wait.
Didn't he say he'd be back?
Yeah, he said a lot of things. More than you have room to write.
So, do you think he'll be back?
Back? I don't know. I don't think so.
Good morning. It's great to be together on Easter. And if I had to be completely honest, I'm not so sure that I would have thought so either. And when we just think about the gospel account, something that we see is that even Jesus's closest followers, those who were with him throughout his whole ministry, his closest friends, even they had such a difficult time on this Easter morning connecting the promises that Jesus had made and the things that he had said with what they were actually experiencing in real time. And so I think we can probably all find ourselves somewhere in that conversation of trying to find ways to have faith and trust God in our lives. And I look at these brothers and sisters in the first century, and I think there's a lot that we can take from their experience. You know, wherever you find yourself this morning, you know, again, we're celebrating Easter. It's really one of the biggest celebrations across the Christian world, and really over time, really since Jesus' death, his burial, his resurrection. But wherever you find yourself on the landscape of faith, we're just so excited that you're connecting with us. And I know that, you know, for some of us, it's just a really big faith move to make a decision to log on and be part of this stream this morning. And if you're, you know, coming to our channel later on and you're watching this afterwards, we're grateful that you're connecting with us as well. And our hope, very simply, is just to help everybody take steps forward in their relationship with God. We believe deeply that God loves you, that God has a plan for you, that he sent his one and only Son into the world to help us, to save us, to help us see a way forward. And we're just excited for anybody and everybody to be able to connect and be part of this conversation this morning. You know, our main theme is we're kind of getting through this season of Easter. Our main theme is this idea of waymaker and Jesus being a waymaker. And it comes from a popular song. And the words are like this. It says, Jesus is a waymaker. He's a miracle worker. He's a promise keeper, and he's light in the darkness. And something that I really believe, and it's something I've just been thinking a lot about, I've been praying about this week, is that Easter and the message of Easter is such a hopeful message. And again, wherever you are, there's a message of hope here for you. And it's really good news. And we talk a lot about in church about how there's good news in the gospel and the message of Jesus. But it's this idea that even when things are uncertain, even when the future is uncertain, even when what's going on in our world right now is uncertain, there's a certainty in Jesus, and there's a certainty in God sending his son and being willing to die for us. And obviously, as we've talked about, through the Easter conversation, he came back to life a couple days later. In a time where perhaps the future is unknown, something that we want to keep focusing on is that we can trust this unknown future to a known God. We can trust his heart, we can trust his power, we can trust the fact that he really does have this tailor-made plan for each one of us. And Easter is such an important part of that plan. Something that I really believe, and I've been, at this whole Christianity thing for a while now. I've celebrated just a few Easters, but something that I really believe is that Easter is a great time to make faith decisions. And I know that there's some of us, perhaps, we've been in church for a long time, and maybe it's just an issue of getting unstuck and moving forward in our faith. Maybe it's helping someone around us to make those same decisions. For some of us, maybe you've not been attending church, or maybe you used to go to church, or maybe you have no idea about Jesus and the message of Easter. But wherever you are, what a great opportunity. As the whole world kind of shines a light on this message of Easter, I just want to kind of throw that out there for you as we get into the scriptures, as we spend time together for the next few minutes here. What an opportunity for you to make a faith decision, to make a step forward in your relationship with God. Perhaps the best news for all of us is that God has a plan, that he has promises that he's already made. And in the time we're in, isn't it just so encouraging to get a little more good news? There's a lot of bad news right now, and if you allow yourself to be inundated by that bad news, it can overcome you. But at a time where maybe there's some uncertainty and there's a lot of bad news, it's just kind of cool to have some good news. And so that's what we're going to be looking at as we get into God's scriptures this morning. Let's take a few moments and pray, and then we'll get into the Bible. Father, it's so great to be together this morning to celebrate Easter. And Father, we're all going to remember where we were for Easter 2020. Most of us, we're going to remember that we were wearing our pajamas and we were sitting in front of a computer or a phone or a TV. Perhaps we're with our family. Maybe some of us are feeling lonely right now, Father. But Father, to be together, even in an online way, and to really celebrate and be reminded of some of the best news in the entire history of the world, I pray that you bless the study of your scriptures. I pray that no matter where we're at, that we feel that there's hope for us. We feel that there's a way forward for us because of your Son, Jesus. We love you. We're grateful for your scriptures. We're grateful for this time. And I pray in your Son's name, amen. We've been talking, in our church community about how Jesus is a way maker. And it's just the idea that even when we don't see a way forward, Jesus can still make a way for us in our lives. We've talked about how he's a miracle worker. And that's something that we're going to draw out today, is that, yeah, he can perform incredible miracles. It takes faith. But the miracle that happened in his life and the power that went into that, we're going to see that that's available in our lives, and that it's a foreshadowing of what God wants to do for me and for you in our spiritual lives. But also this idea that he is light in the darkness. And if you're anything like me, man, there's a lot of darkness in the world, and I see it from time to time. Maybe you're even going through one of these seasons where it just feels dark right now. You don't feel like you have a lot of hope, or you don't feel like you have a clear way forward. And something that I've noticed is that the clearest way to see Jesus as a way maker, and the clearest way that that becomes obvious to us, is in those times where we don't see a way ourselves, and then we see what he does and how he meets us where we're at and he moves us forward. And the best way to see the miracles at work is when we have the faith to see that, man, we need something miraculous right now, and only God can help us get from where we are now to where we should be going next. And then even when we think about this whole idea of, the darkness, and maybe you're in darkness right now, maybe you feel like you're in one of those tough seasons, the most encouraging thing is when you see the light penetrating the darkness and you see Jesus' hopefulness and his vision that he has for your life. And so that's really what we want to draw out of our study today. I really believe that to understand what's happening on Easter Sunday in the scriptures and really the events around this weekend, Good Friday, yesterday, Saturday, today, Easter Sunday, to really understand that, it's important to kind of maybe take a step back for about a week. So to look at what happened last weekend and to understand some of the events that led to what we're celebrating here today. And something that I really want to kind of draw out, and I'm hoping you'll see this from the scriptures, is that the folks that were closest to Jesus, his faithful followers, his closest friends, people that if you've been around church, you know these names. It's amazing to see that they went through an incredible journey themselves. There didn't seem necessarily at all points in this text that there was a way forward, and yet God interceded and made a way forward for them. And I think what we're going to find is that no matter where we are, that we're kind of just like them in the journey of faith that we find ourselves in today. The Apostle John wrote about an experience, about a week before. So we're talking, Easter Sunday today, last Sunday, which we traditionally call Palm Sunday. The Apostle John writes about this in his Gospel, chapter 12, verse 12 to 19. But he talks about this picture of Jesus entering the city of Jerusalem, and he gives this really amazing kind of snapshot of Jesus entering the city to a king's welcome. People have this incredible greeting for him, and he's being celebrated as a king. He's walking into the city. People are flooding into the streets. It's this incredible celebration. And what's really cool is this is really just a fulfillment of a prophecy from hundreds of years later in the Old Testament of the Bible. Zechariah 9, verse 9, it just says this. It says, "See, your king comes to you, righteous and victorious, lowly and riding on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey." And this word victorious is probably the best word to describe that Sunday that preceded Easter Sunday, because Jesus and his followers, it was madness. They were like celebrities, rock stars. They were like the influencers of the day for that moment. And they entered the city and the people are just going crazy. And what an incredible picture, because all of a sudden people who had been following Jesus for years were like, okay, this is it. He's coming back to Jerusalem. He's going to be proclaiming himself as the Savior, the King, the Messiah. Everything's going to go great. Spoiler alert, and if you've read ahead at home, you probably know that things didn't go exactly how Jesus' disciples anticipated it going. But, what we see is over the next couple days following Palm Sunday, there was a lot of conflict between Jesus and the religious leaders of his day. I shared this in many a sermon, but I'll say this today. Jesus did not come to set up a new religion. Jesus came to help us to have the heart that we need to have for God and showed us how to love other people. And you should take a sign, it's a really cool sign for us, and you should take the sign from Jesus and the way he interacted with religious folk, the fact that he conflicted with them, the fact that they had so many, tense moments. I think that should be encouraging for us, that God's heart is not just to have you be a religious person or be a church goer or to have certain titles. Jesus actually came and he opposed a lot of the practices and the hypocrisy of the religious leaders. So the next couple of days that followed, Jesus did things like he cleared out the temple, because people were in the temple. It was supposed to be a place of worship. And what was happening is folks were going there and selling different things to try to make money and have personal gain. So Jesus clears them all out of the temple, and that kind of put him on a collision course with some of these religious leaders. And then we see in Matthew's account, the Gospel of Matthew, in chapters 21 through 23, Jesus does some pretty intense teaching over these couple days in this week between Palm Sunday and Easter Sunday. And he really goes at some of the attitudes and the disposition of the heart of these religious leaders. In Matthew 23, Jesus says something really powerful, and he just says this. He says, "The greatest among you will be your servant. For those who exalt themselves, and he may have looked over at some of those religious leaders as he said this, for those who exalt themselves, they'll be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. And those of us who maybe know our Bible a little bit, this kind of comes back full circle. This is some of Jesus's last teaching, but it comes back full circle to one of his first sermons, the Sermon on the Mount, where he taught very similar things. He says, hey, if you lift yourself up, God will have to humble you. But if you take a humble disposition and you love and you serve, God can lift you up. What people didn't know in that moment was this was also a foreshadowing of what was about to happen in Jesus' life in the days that would follow. By Thursday of that week, the Thursday now before Easter Sunday, Jesus was speaking very openly about what was about to happen in his life and the implications for his followers. To his disciples, he said in Luke chapter 22 and verse 15, he says, I have been very eager to eat this Passover meal with you before my suffering begins. And there's a couple things in that message. And they're like, okay, cool. So we're going to have a meal together. This is going to be awesome. We got to do Uber Eats because we can't go to the restaurant right now. But we're going to have a meal and Jesus is eager. That's great. Oh, wait, that whole suffering thing. Well, what are you talking about, Jesus? And you could see that he was trying to help them understand that things weren't going to go how they had hoped it was going to go initially and how they anticipated things were going to go that week. And he says, there's going to be some suffering. This meal is traditionally referred to as the Last Supper. And the reason for that is Jesus would get up from this meal and then go to the Garden of Gethsemane. And you can read about this. Matthew talks about it in chapter 26 of his gospel. But Jesus is in the Garden of Gethsemane and he has this epic prayer time. And it's about one of the most honest moments we see between Jesus and his Father in heaven. And he's just like, God, I don't want to do this. I don't want to go through this suffering that is about to happen. So he goes from that meal to the garden and having a prayer time. And his friends, his closest friends, the guys are like, hey, Jesus, we'll be with you no matter what. We'll stick it in with you. We'll go through, whatever happens. Peter's like, I'll even die for you. And he says, okay, all I need is just to stay awake in the garden here while I pray. Now, sorry for the spoiler alert, but Jesus knew that Judas had already been in agreement with some of Jesus's enemies and those religious leaders that he was preaching against. He knew they were coming to arrest him. And so he's like, guys, just stay awake so that I can have some prayer time before this happens. And these same guys are like, we got your back, Jesus. We're right there with you. We'll die for you. You click over to the next scene and they're just like lying against a tree and, sawing wood and sleeping. He's like, guys, come on, wake up. This is such an important time. That was Thursday evening. And really interesting, the Thursday that precedes today, Sunday, Easter morning. And really that Thursday and the 24 hours that followed that really kind of unfolded at lightning speed. Like it was the speed of light. It just one thing after another seemed to happen very quickly. And I gotta think though that for those who were actually going through it, although things were happening really quickly, what we're gonna find is perhaps they maybe had a tough time processing things as things were coming at them. I really want to see. I want us to see ourselves. I want you to see yourself. I want me to see myself in some of these events that unfolded. So as we said, in the garden, it was there that Judas on Thursday night led the officers to Jesus. And he said, hey, Jesus, what's up? They did their secret handshake. And Jesus like, come on, dude. And Judas leads the soldiers right to Jesus. And that's where he's arrested. That night, so Thursday evening before Easter, Jesus is brought before the Jewish leaders in what was probably a secretive gathering. It was seemingly late at night. And from there, they brought him to the Roman governor and to the Roman authorities because Jerusalem was occupied by Rome at that time. So the Jews, although they wanted to punish Jesus, although they were even hoping that they could see Jesus crucified or killed at that point, didn't have the ability or the authority to do that without the Roman governor essentially giving his blessing to that happening. So they brought him to the Roman governor. Then he was passed along to a dude named King Herod. King Herod's like, I don't want anything to do with this, sent him back to Pilate. So this is all happening on Thursday night, late into the evening. I say that, and I think it's important to understand then, by Good Friday, which is 2 days ago, by Good Friday, all of Jesus's followers would have woken up to the news that Jesus had been arrested the night before, and that all of this trial and all these things were happening while they were sleeping on Thursday night. So everyone wakes up on Friday morning to the news that Jesus, who had just entered the city as a triumphant king, and everyone's saying he's the Son of God, and he's like, I'm the Son of God. Now they're waking up to the news on Good Friday that the Son of God, their Messiah, their teacher, their friend, had been arrested. If you think about those 24 hours, they would have woken up that morning to that news, and they would have went to bed on Good Friday with Jesus had been tried and crucified and put in his tomb. That all happened in one day. So they woke up hearing he was arrested, and they went to bed that night with Jesus having been crucified and seeing his dead body. What an incredible series of events. And you can imagine just being there and processing that and going through that. All of the fact that all of this happened in one day. And if you've ever experienced trauma or maybe a sudden loss, and I know, and I've talked to so many folks in our community and in our church and our faith community that, we've gone through so many challenges. If you've ever been through trauma, a sudden loss, or you get, news like that, it's amazing how things can happen so fast, but at the same time, it can feel like everything's kind of going in slow motion. And I got to think for those closest to Jesus, they kind of had that tension of, whoa, a lot's happening here, but also that things probably just kind of got really weird, and gravity probably ceased to exist for them. And there was this feeling in their stomach of really feeling, probably just processing everything that was happening. For many, I really believe that this day really gave an opportunity for them to examine where their faith was. It's one thing when you follow Jesus day in and day out, and you see him do things like, hey, walking on water. You're like, oh, there's Jesus walking on the water again. Or, hey, we're hungry. We can't go to the restaurant. We don't need Uber Eats because Jesus can multiply food. And I'm not saying it didn't take faith, but I guess what I'm saying is this 24-hour period really put a lot of these early Christians and these early followers of Jesus, it put their faith to the test. And it really caused them to have to ask some very real questions. We often call this past Friday Good Friday, but if you lived through it, I don't necessarily feel like you would look at that Friday and think that it was good. It was probably anything but good in terms of your experience. There was a couple men that were kind of intertwined into this narrative and this story, and they were both followers of Jesus. Their names were Nicodemus and Joseph. Nicodemus was a prominent community leader. He was a member of the Sanhedrin. And for those of you who know your Bibles, earlier in the Gospel of John, Jesus had an interaction with Nicodemus, and he said, hey, if you want to follow me, if you want to be part of God's kingdom, you need to be born again. You need to be born of water and the Spirit. And Nicodemus was kind of like, well, what are you talking about? I can't be born again. I can't go back in my mom's tummy. And Jesus is like, silly Nicodemus. No, we're talking about baptism. And it's interesting because now we fast forward to the end of Jesus' life and what Jesus is going through here in the Passion Week, the week leading up to Easter. And we see that Nicodemus is actually one of Jesus's disciples. So he took Jesus's teaching and his example to heart, and he actually decided to follow him. So he was a prominent community leader. And then there's this other man, Joseph, who's a wealthy business owner, and he had some means to him. And we see through the Gospels that these two men kind of worked together, and they both decided that after Jesus had been killed and after all that had happened, they decided to go to the Roman governor, to go to Pilate and ask for the body. And they probably had to pay some money for that, but they said, you know what, he's our Savior. he's our teacher, he's our rabbi, he's our friend. We're going to make sure that he has a proper burial. And a lot of folks didn't know this, but these guys were both part of the Sanhedrin, and they were both Christians, and they were trying to live in both of those worlds. We'll talk a little bit more about that afterwards, but I think what we're going to see in these guys is the events of this Thursday to Friday that went before Easter Sunday. It really caused them to see the need to step out in their faith, to make their faith public even. Because I think what probably was happening was they were trying to keep their role, they're trying to keep their reputation amongst the religious leaders, and then also be followers of Jesus over here. And Jesus' death and Jesus and all that had happened there caused them to make these faith decisions of actually going out. And you think of what they went through. They actually made the preparations to take the body down carefully from the cross after Jesus had died. And they had wrapped the body so that it could be moved. And the scriptures tell us that they purchased 75 pounds of spices and a mix of myrrh and aloes in order to start an embalming process. And so they're going through all of this. And you got to think at this point, they're still in shock because it wasn't that long ago. It was only days ago that Jesus was being lifted up as this Savior, as this King. And now they're the ones overseeing the funeral procession and the burial of the body, and they have this dead body of Jesus in front of them. And the dead body of Jesus is like every other dead body. It looks and it smells and it feels like a dead body, and they're having to process what Jesus said and what he promised and what they saw in real time in front of them. You know, there was another one of Jesus' followers, and his name was Judas, and we talked a little bit about him, noticeably absent from some of this text. And interestingly enough, if you're some of Jesus' followers at this point, you know, you're probably catching wind of the fact that Judas was part of the plot to arrest Jesus. And you're hearing rumors, and rumors are swirling that he did it for money and that he actually sold out Jesus, you know, one of his closest friends. Now, Judas was a leader. Judas was somebody who did miracles alongside Jesus. He was one of Jesus' closest friends, an apostle. And so if you're part of that whole band of followers, Jesus' followers, the disciples, and you're seeing Judas and you're hearing, man, he's not there because he actually was part of the plot to have him arrested. And then word's now coming out that because of his guilt and because of his remorse, that Judas ended up taking his own life. And as it went, going from a spiritual leader and one of Jesus' closest friends to now somebody that's not in the picture anymore and having such a discouraging end to his, you know, his connection with those disciples and his physical life. And then, of course, there's someone else that's noticeably absent, and that's the Apostle Peter. And for those of you who don't know, Peter was one of Jesus' closest friends. He was part of Jesus' inner circle. And perhaps what was most shocking for the Christians as they're mourning the loss of Jesus and they're processing the fact that he had been crucified and all that had happened on this Good Friday, they're now also hearing reports that Peter, who Jesus called the Rock, they're hearing reports that Peter disavowed Jesus and he actually walked away from the faith. And he did it in a public fashion. People in the church are hearing reports that, yeah, Peter was out there and he was saying, I don't even know who Jesus is. I'm not even part of this whole Christianity thing. And so now Peter's not part of this either. You know, you got this picture, these few remaining disciples all huddled together in the presence of their dead Lord. And after all they'd gone through, and this is all happening from the moment they woke up that morning, and they're still in that same Good Friday, and it's without Jesus' help, and it's without Judas, and it's without Peter. How could they have possibly caught up emotionally to all the events that were taking place around Jesus' death at that time? I mean, if you just put yourself in that situation, how could they have possibly processed all that was taking place in the city and around them, all that had happened to Jesus? You know, how could they even have had time to understand or to really grieve this not so good Friday? There's also a follower of Jesus, a woman by the name of Mary Magdalene. And, you know, the next 24 hours led into a time called the Passover. And that kind of built in some first century social distancing. for a period of time there, so you may relate to that a little bit in the time we're in. But this was probably one of the first times where Jesus' followers could catch their breath, including someone like Mary. Mary had been with Jesus all throughout. She was one of his early followers. She's throughout, his ministry. And we see that as we come into the week of Easter, Mary Magdalene is a really prominent role. She has a really prominent role in in these events that led up to Easter. And it brings us then to Easter morning, this morning that we're celebrating today. And in Matthew 28, we see that Mary Magdalene, a close friend of Jesus, a follower of his, along with Jesus' mother and another just group of women, some of the close friends, they were the ones that set out early that morning after the Passover. Everything was kind of locked down for a day, but that next day, they're the ones who rushed to go to the tomb to see Jesus. And what the Gospels tell us is that they wanted to anoint the body of Jesus. Essentially, they wanted to bring spices and really just kind of a re-embalming, if you will. So that's what they set out to do, and we read about that in Matthew 28. But when they arrived at the tomb on Easter morning, they saw that there was this large stone that was put in front of Jesus' tomb. It was meant to seal the tomb, and nobody could move it. And it was meant to kind of lock everything down there so no one could come in, come out. They saw that big rock was actually moved to the side. And it's interesting because, and I think this is really important, because maybe as you're watching today and you're connecting with us, maybe you're not a Christian, or maybe you don't even know where you are in your faith. Maybe you've had doubts. Maybe you're trying to figure out even, where you fit into just this whole faith conversation. Something that's really important for those of us who are trying to figure out our faith right now is that as much as Easter weekend is a time of celebration and it's a time of hopefulness, and it's a time of good news, which we're seeing and we're going to see as we come out of this study. As much as it's a celebration of those things, what's really interesting is that it's also a really good picture of what struggling for faith looks like. And what we see is in those who were closest to Jesus, those who physically, followed him and had a relationship with him, those who saw his most incredible miracles, those who could say, yes, he's a way maker because he made a way for me in my life. Even those folks, interestingly enough, when they saw the empty tomb, they didn't jump to the fact that they assumed that Jesus had resurrected. In fact, Mary, incredibly faithful, very devout, she loves Jesus with all of her heart. Jesus had done incredible things in her life to that point. Mary's assumption is the women kind of ran away at that point. Initially, their assumption was someone had stolen Jesus's body. So Jesus had already told them, I'm going to raise from the dead. And they're like, this is going to be awesome. But think of the toll of the past day and a half and the toll that had taken on their faith. So now they saw the stone rolled to the side. They saw the empty tomb. And some of those who are the most faithful, and some of those who are the most spiritually inclined, some of those who actually walked alongside Jesus himself, they went to, I guess somebody must have stolen the body. And I say that for those of us who are on the journey of even just trying to figure out where we are in our faith and we're trying to take steps forward. Man, I feel like there's so much grace. I feel like God totally understands how difficult it is sometimes to have faith in this world, to live by faith and not by sight. Because there's what Jesus says and then there's what we experience. And I really believe faith is finding a way to bridge those two things and really see the events in our life through a spiritual lens. I think this is something that we can't skip over, that those who are most faithful, even in certain moments in this story, were not the most faithful all the time. And I think God gives an incredible allowance. There's a lot of grace for us to have ups and downs in our spiritual journey, as evidenced in some of these incredible heroes of faith. You know, when Mary and Jesus' own mother, when they had their doubts and they're, kind of saying, hey, we think someone stole the body, really, really cool. Jesus actually appears to them and appears specifically. It says that Mary Magdalene was one of the first people to see the resurrected Jesus. So Sunday morning, after all that had happened, we see that Jesus is risen and he appears to a woman, which I believe at that time was a big statement, the respect that he had. And I don't think that was unintentional. I really believe that Jesus was making a statement, honestly, for Mary, but also for all of his followers. And he allowed her to be the one that really saw him in his resurrected form. And so they're now running back, Mary and Jesus' mom, the other Mary. There's a lot of Marys in the New Testament. And some of their crew, they're all running back now to see the disciples. Now, the disciples were probably hiding out at that point. They're probably afraid for their lives because they knew that Jesus was killed. They knew that Judas had taken his own life. They knew that Peter had left the faith. So whoever was remaining, and at this point, Peter's back having fellowship with them, but they're in hiding and they're fearful. Mary and the women come to talk to the guys and they say, we've seen Jesus and he's resurrected from the dead. And interestingly enough, the response of these guys was not, oh, wow, Jesus came back from the dead just like he said he would. They actually dismissed the women's testimony thinking that they were crazy, thinking this was crazy talk. So here's Jesus' actual disciples struggling with the very thing that Jesus promised would happen after he died. If you're someone who appreciates Jesus's teachings, and maybe you're not quite there where you believe he's the Son of God, you maybe even have a tough time making that jump of faith that he came back from the dead on Easter morning. But maybe you just appreciate his teachings, who he is historically. I really believe that, this whole narrative and seeing the wrestling match that people had with their faith, even in the Bible, I think it shows that you're in pretty good company this morning. And I don't think we all wake up and we just instantly have this, through the roof faith. I think people have to wrestle and really reason and figure out, okay, what happened and how did it happen and how does that connect with God's greater plan for my life? Jesus' best friends, his closest followers, had some bad moments within these few days around Easter. And it wasn't like Jesus hadn't told them beforehand. It wasn't like he hadn't given them kind of a peek behind the curtain and said, hey, here's what's going to happen. He did everything he can to prepare them, and yet they still went through this difficult time in their faith. And if it shows us anything just for the here and the now in real time, it's that God really does value faith, and we've got to make faith a big priority in our life, but faith doesn't come easily. There's an effort that we have to put in to coming through the other side of events and coming through circumstances, trusting God and seeing God's hand at work in our life. From that morning and really that first Easter that we're talking about out of the Gospels, but when you think of from that moment to the weeks and the months and the years and the decades that followed, and here's the good news, some of these same folks that we're talking about, that had moments of doubt and had moments where they even walked away from their faith or they wandered or they drifted, some of these same folks were some of the most influential Christians that would go on to literally talking to anybody and everybody and sharing this good news of these events for the rest of their lives. Some of them, in fact, would actually go on to give up their own lives, and they were killed for preaching this same message and preaching this same good news that in this moment they were having a tough time really wrestling through. And I think it's a great picture for us that we can come out the other side, that you can go through a difficult time and you can wrestle and you can struggle, but there's still hope. There's still a potential future there. Jesus is a way maker. It doesn't always feel like there's a way. Sometimes we don't see the way, but even when it doesn't seem like it, even when we don't see it, Jesus can make a way, and that's evidenced in the lives here of some of these early Christians. I think of the time that we're in our world right now, we're navigating this virus, COVID, and, think of just the the effects of the incredible effects of a global pandemic. And every day you hear things and perhaps you read stuff and people are trying to just really try to understand the far-reaching effects that this is having in our world currently, but even the effects that this is going to have in our world going forward. Very rarely is there ever an event that just becomes a human event for everybody on the planet. But we all have this shared human experience right now that is very unique to the time that we're in. And I know it's affected a lot of us in different ways, and I'm sure for most of us, how you're affected by this. We're coming into Easter, and this is a great time to remember Jesus, and it's a great celebration, but we can't divorce it from just kind of how we've been doing and how life has been even over these last few weeks. There's some of us, how you're doing kind of changes day by day, or if you're like me, sometimes it's hour by hour. I thought it was a good day and then it became a bad day pretty quickly. And, there's a lot of us that are, we're wrestling through fear. We're wrestling with our doubts. We're struggling with things like loneliness, or perhaps it's anxiety or depression, things that maybe were already a challenge, but now it's heightened because of the times we're in. I've spoken to a lot of people who, we ourselves are doing pretty good and we're navigating this thing and we're finding ways through it, but it's the ones that we love most that we see being affected by it. In some cases, during this time of greatest need, the pandemic is preventing us from just being together with those we care about most. We can't visit. Perhaps you can't travel. You can't touch. You can't hug. You can't even be in the same room with those that you care about most in this world. Some of us, we've lost hours at work. We've been furloughed. Some of us have lost our jobs during this time. And my heart goes out to you, and I pray a ton for all of those who've been affected by this. Some of us, we still go to work, but by going to work, we put ourselves in harm's way, and we're serving our neighbors, and we're serving the community, and we're on the front lines, and our health is at risk because we're doing our jobs, and we're trying to do the best we can in the places that we live. There's some of us that, we're just trying to figure out what all this means. I've heard a lot of people say, well, clearly this is God's will and he's doing this. And other people are saying, well, where's God during this time? And I'll just say this, man, what an opportunity to push the pause button on a lot of things and ask the most important questions. Easter is that opportunity, I believe, every year, but in the face of this pandemic, in the face where a lot of things have just kind of been silenced, a lot of the noise has kind of been put to the side, what a great time to figure out where am I in my spiritual life? Where am I in my faith? For me personally, one of the things that's been really hard is just to be away from my family during a time like this. And especially, we've had folks close to us. We've had, friends, but even family members who've gone through some difficult times, some health challenges, being in and out of the hospital. A close family friend lost his father to the virus last week. And that's just gut-wrenching. We're praying, and it's just so hard to see people go through these types of things. And so we have this shared human experience right now that we're all navigating, and these disappointments for some of us, and the uncertainty that goes along with it. And I think no matter who you are, or where you live, or what age you are, or your gender, or what level of faith you have, each one of us in some way, I believe, can connect with the events of what we read about here in this weekend, the Good Friday, or really Thursday night to Sunday morning, and the level of uncertainty and the level of probably anxiety and stress, the mourning, the sadness, the heavy-heartedness that went along with seeing Jesus arrested, seeing Jesus beaten, seeing Jesus led through the street as a criminal, seeing Jesus hoisted up on the cross and then nailed to that cross and left to die alone, then seeing Jesus' dead body. And you're thinking, but what about all the promises? And what about all the things that God said he was going to do? And it didn't seem to go the way that people had anticipated. And I think of the time we're in right now. And friends, I really believe there's a lot of parallel. There's a lot of uncertainty. There's a lot of doubt. There's a lot of heavy-heartedness. But if we can take the lessons that we see here, and we see the fact that even though things got challenging, even though there was darkness, Jesus eventually became the light to that darkness. And even though it seemed like there wasn't a way, Jesus actually made a way. And by resurrecting from the dead, he gave hope now to all of his followers, but really anybody through all time, that there's a way forward no matter how bad things are in your life. That even in a time where it looked like the only thing that could get them out of where they were, the only way forward was a miracle. Guess what? The miracle worker worked a miracle, and he came back from the dead just like he said he would. If that happened on this first Easter weekend, I wonder what God is able to do in your life right now, today, this week. You know, Jesus is a waymaker. He's a miracle worker. He's a promise keeper, and he's light in the darkness. Jesus wipes away all tears. He mends the broken heart. And even when we don't see it, he's working. And even when we don't feel it, he's working. And as we consider all that had happened in the lives of his closest followers and how dark things must have felt, it's amazing how he flipped the script so quickly to now this becoming the event that we now celebrate 2,000 years later as one of the greatest weekends ever. We call Friday Good Friday, and the people were there like, it didn't feel so good. But for us, it's good because we see the end of the movie. We see how it all unfolded. I really believe that faith is trusting that that's what's going to happen with our lives as well. You know, if there's one thing interwoven into the story of Easter, it's just the simple idea that Jesus wants something for you, not from you. Jesus wants something for you, not from you. And maybe that's not always been your experience with religion or even, going to church, because at times in churches, maybe people want something from you, it seems like first. Well, the thing we want is we want you to come and attend our church, or we want you to give your money to our cause, or we want you to sit up straight or dress a certain way or talk a certain way or be a certain way. But the thing that we see in Jesus time and again is that he wants something for you long before he's asking for anything from you. You know, Ephesians chapter 1, and this is a passage where we're going to kind of now pivot and make some application for our own lives. Ephesians chapter 1, it says in verse 19, it's talking about the incomparably great power for those of us who believe. So if you just would have faith, and if you would just accept the fact that Jesus is the Son of God, and you'd be willing to change your life and be baptized and be his follower. It says there is this incomparably great power for those of us who believe. And it says that power is the same as the mighty strength he exerted when he raised Christ from the dead and seated him at the right hand in the heavenly realms. You know, this is written a number of years later by the Apostle Paul, one of Jesus's followers who became a Christian much later, who also had a really powerful conversion study. His starting point was conversion process rather. His starting point was he killed Christians, and Jesus was like, hey, you should stop killing Christians, and by the way, you should be a Christian. And Paul went from killing Christians to being one of the greatest preachers in that generation. And so he's talking here about this incomparably great power, and he's saying the power that we see in the scriptures, the greatest power is the power that raised Jesus from the dead. But then he pivots and he says, and that power that we read about here, he says, it's available for you and for me. He's saying that same power, the power that he exerted in Jesus, can now be available for those of us who believe. And I wonder, as we think about Jesus being a waymaker, and we think about Jesus being a miracle worker, and you think of what that, the relevance in our lives, I wonder if we could see some of this power come alive in our lives if we perhaps can respond like some of the folks that were in this narrative that we read about. You know, I think about Nicodemus and Joseph, and we talked about these guys were kind of really well put together religious leaders. So they were kind of one foot in, one foot out. On one hand, they were part of the Sanhedrin. So they're religious leaders and they wore the right clothes and they said the right things. And they were part of, they got invited to all the nice parties and caviar and whatever the Pharisees ate. Probably not caviar, I don't think. So that's the life they lived. But then secretly, they became Jesus followers and they became disciples. And this event of Jesus' death, his burial, and his resurrection, what we see is it forced them to go all in following Jesus. There was a middle point that they were at, and this event caused them to see, you know what? There's nothing more important than my faith in God. There's nothing more important than putting Jesus first and being his follower. And what we see is they took the steps by even going and getting the body of Jesus and making sure that he was taken care of and that he was embalmed. They were making this public declaration that we're all in for Jesus, that it's all about following him. And I wonder how many of us who are connecting here online today or watching, at a later time, I wonder how many of us can identify with just this need to be like one of these guys, being like Nicodemus or being like Joseph, where, man, maybe you've had some faith, but it's just time to go the whole way in and really kind of giving your life over to God in that way. You know, I think of Mary Magdalene, who we see was just completely changed by grace. You know, we see that earlier in the Gospels, Jesus healed her, and really from that point on, she was steady, and she was part of this whole narrative. She's one of the few people that we see that doesn't disappear at any point here, and she's the one that Jesus actually appeared to when he came back on Easter morning. And when I think about Mary, I just think about some of us who perhaps the biggest thing is we just need to connect with what Jesus has already done in our lives. Man, you've already been saved from your sin. You've already been called out of darkness into the wonderful light. But like Mary, you got to let this grace take root, to finally take root in your actual life right now, today, this week. And you know, this grace is not without effect. I really believe, but by being like Mary and allowing God's grace to affect us, that should be seen in our marriage. That should be seen in our relationships. That should be seen at the office when you go back to the office. That should be seen in the community. That should be seen in your one another relationships with other Christians. Mary was someone who was changed by Jesus' grace, and it affected everything going forward in her life. And then I think about Peter. And if there's one way to describe Peter, I feel like Peter was just the incredible picture of a comeback story. Peter legitimately disowned his faith. He wandered. He said, I don't even know Jesus. So he walked away completely from being a Jesus follower. And then but a few weeks later, we see that Peter was the man that stood up and actually preached one of the first sermons telling everybody about what had happened on Easter weekend. And he would go on to become one of the most influential leaders in that first century church. And the thing that we see in Peter is that no matter how bad things get, no matter how long it's been since you've been in church, no matter how long it's been since you've said a prayer or opened the Bible or anything like that, what we see in Peter is that no matter how far things go, no matter how far you feel like you fall away, God can always reach you. There's always a comeback story to be had. If there's hope for Peter, then there's hope for you. And what a message of hope this morning, that you could be like any one of these folks. Maybe it's being like Joseph and Nicodemus, and it's really just going all in. Maybe it's being like Mary and just saying, hey, I need to let God's grace actually have an effect in my life and really influence the different corners of my life. Maybe it's like Peter, and it's like, man, I've been in the darkness, but I know what the light is like, and it's time for a comeback. You know, I'll close by just saying this. We've talked about how Jesus is the way maker. He makes a way when we don't even know that there is a way. And he tells us that he is the way in this world. He is the way in your life. He is the way out of the situation that you may find yourself in right now. He's the way up out of a pit that perhaps you've fallen in your spiritual life. and he's the way forward no matter how stuck you've felt to date. And I really believe that if we can make this pivot to saying, you know, it doesn't necessarily feel like there's a way right now. Maybe it doesn't look like there's a way, but because Jesus is the way maker, because he made a way for them back then, I see that this power is also available in my life. He can make a way forward for me here right now. If we can make that connection, I believe that's all the faith that we need to have to see Jesus be the way maker in our lives and coming out of this Easter weekend. You know, in a few moments, I'm going to pray for us, and then I just want to invite you. You know, the moderator is going to be throwing a link in the chat, which is probably over here, or maybe it's over here. I always forget that. There's chat somewhere going on here. By the way, glad you got to chat today. Hopefully you got to chat. But the moderator is going to put a link in there for a Zoom call, and we're going to have just a Zoom call meeting / prayer time for anybody who wants to take a next step in their faith. Maybe it's just, hey, I want to pray with somebody, or I just want to talk to somebody about the lesson today. Maybe it's just, you know, the simple decision that I want to get in the Bible and do some Bible studies. We got a whole virtual Bible study series that we can do over various platforms. And it doesn't matter where you live, or it doesn't matter what your demographic, there's somebody that can help you. So I want to say that that's the call to action today. If you feel like coming out of this message that you want to take a next step, I want to encourage you, jump on that Zoom call and connect with somebody on our team. And if you want to pray together, you just want someone to pray for you, we're here to do that. We want something for you, not from you. And the thing we want for you is for Jesus to be your way maker, and we want to help you work towards that in your life.